Chapter 1. The last of the sun had bled away below the hills, leaving the sky a bruise of violet and indigo. In the small workshop by the river, a single point of light held the gathering dark at bay. It was a soft, honeyed glow, the captured essence of a sunbeam radiating from the belly of a finished lantern. It was Lin's work, a globe of silk and bamboo that pulsed with a gentle, living warmth, and it was by this warmth that she still worked. The light gilded the landscape of her hands. It pooled in the deep carved canyons of her knuckles and traced the delicate, branching river systems of veins across her skin. These hands, which had built 1,000 such lanterns, now moved with the slow, deliberate grace of ceremony. A brush, fine as a dragonfly's leg, was dipped in ink, and with a breath held deep in her chest, she painted a single, perfect stalk of bamboo onto the taut silk. The stroke was as sure and fluid as a memory. Around her, the workshop breathed its own quiet life. The air was a tapestry of scents, the sharp, clean perfume of shaved bamboo, the rich, nutty tang of tung oil that sealed the paper against the river. Damp caress, and, seeping up through the earthen floor, the deep, loamy smell of the rice paddies, of wet earth and crushed green things settling into sleep. This solitary light, this island of work and scent, felt like a small fortress against the immense blue velvet quiet of the coming night. The faintest whisper of movement, a disruption in the thick air, made her pause. She did not need to look up. Small feet, bare and silent on the packed earth, had entered her sanctuary. "Amma," a voice soft as moth-wing said. Lin set her brush down on its porcelain rest. She turned, her joints protesting with a quiet litany of aches, and a smile bloomed on her face, softening the intricate map of her wrinkles. Her grandson, Wei, stood just at the edge of the lantern's glow, his small form haloed in gold, his eyes dark and vast. "Little Wei," she murmured, her voice a low, gentle rasp, like dry leaves skittering over stone. "It is time for sleep?" He nodded, stepping fully into the light. He leaned against her knee, his small head resting on her thigh. She could feel the warmth of him through the thin cotton of her trousers. He pointed a small finger toward the open window frame. "The wind is sleepy tonight, Amma. Listen." Lin stilled and listened with him. Outside, the great grove of bamboo that lined the riverbank had begun to stir. It was not a thrashing, but a slow, rhythmic sighing, a vast exhalation that seemed to rise from the very soil. It was the sound of 1,000 green leaves whispering to one another in the dark. "It sounds like the sky is breathing," Wei said, his voice drowsy and full of wonder. Lin's hand came to rest on his hair, her fingers combing gently through the fine, dark silk. She didn't answer with words. She simply held him there, in the small, warm circle of light, while the world outside took its deep, slow breaths. He stayed for a moment longer, a small, solid anchor of affection, then straightened up. He pressed a quick, soft kiss to her hand and was gone as silently as he had come, a small shadow swallowed by the larger shadows of the house. The silence he left behind was different. It was heavier. The golden light of her lantern, once a fortress, now seemed fragile, a single candle flame flickering in an endless expanse. Lin looked from her half-finished work to the open window. The landscape was rendered in shades of silver and black. The canals which fed the paddies were threads of mercury under the nascent moonlight. In the distance, the hulking forms of the water buffalo were not animals but small, sleeping mountains, their great shoulders hunched against the earth. A quiet melancholy, familiar as the scent of the river, settled over her. It was the weight of twilight itself, the feeling of a world dimming. She felt her own light dimming with it, the oil in her own lamp burning low. A deep, protective love for this place, for the sleeping buffalo and the whispering bamboo, and most of all for the small boy now tucked in his bed, swelled in her chest. It was an ache, a quiet, profound anxiety, not for herself, but for the continuity of things. Who would listen for the breathing sky when she was no longer here to hear it? Who would keep the light burning against the vast and patient dark? The air in the workshop suddenly felt too thick, too heavy with the ghosts of finished work and the burden of her thoughts. Drawn by an unseen current, she rose and stepped to the threshold, her bare feet meeting the cool, damp stone of the doorway. She drew the night air into her lungs. It was cool and clean, and on it, she felt the touch of the wind Wei had spoken of, a soft, deliberate caress against her cheek, as gentle as a sigh. She looked up. The sky was a deep, fathomless ocean of indigo, scattered with the first diamond dust of stars. But her eyes were not drawn to them. They were drawn to a cloud. It was unlike any she had seen. It was not a storm cloud, pregnant with rain and fury, nor a wisp of fair weather fluff. It was a long, impossibly slow-moving river of vapor that stretched across a vast portion of the heavens. It did not block the stars but seemed to coexist with them, its edges faintly iridescent in the moonlight, shimmering with the soft, pearlescent sheen of an oyster shell's interior. It moved with a serene, majestic slowness, not pushed by the wind, but seeming to be the wind itself. It was ancient, and it was alive, and as she watched its silent, inexorable passage, a memory surfaced from the deep, silted riverbed of her mind. It was a voice, thin and reedy, her own grandmother's voice, telling a story by the light of a fire long since turned to ash. A story of the Long Yun, the cloud dragon, not a beast of scale and fire to be feared, but a guardian, a silent, benevolent god who drifted through the highest heavens, whose soft breath was the nourishing mist that fed the tea, leaves, and whose gentle serpentine passage through the night sky created the very winds that lulled the tired world to sleep. Lin stood there, bathed in the pale moonlight, her face turned to the sky. The great, shimmering cloud river drifted on, a silent promise moving through the dark. The name was a whisper on her own lips, a taste of forgotten words. Long Yun. For the first time that evening, the deep, quiet ache in her heart did not vanish, but it eased. A knot she hadn't known she was holding began to loosen. It was the first faint note of a lullaby she had long forgotten she knew, a flicker of comfort arriving on the breath of the breathing sky. Chapter 2. The lamp burned low, a single, unwavering eye of amber in the deep blue shadows of the workshop. It smelled of beeswax and thyme. Beneath its patient gaze, the loom held the rhythm of the house, a steady and clack-clack that was less a sound and more a pulse, the familiar beat of a heart that had measured out May's days for 50 years. Her hands, gnarled and knowing as old roots, moved through the warp and weft with a grace that defied their age. The shuttle, worn smooth and dark with her own history, flew from one side to the other, a small, loyal bird building a nest of silk. But tonight, the rhythm felt hollow. The work, which was usually a meditation, a silent conversation between her hands and the thread, was merely labor. Her thoughts were a tangled skein, catching on a single looping thread. The profound weariness of a life where each day was a careful, deliberate repetition of the one before. It was a good life, a useful one, but the color had faded from it, bleached by too many suns. Earlier, in the dust-gilded light of late afternoon, her granddaughter had been a small, bright flame in the quiet courtyard. Lynn, with the boundless faith of her 7 years, had knelt and traced the serpentine shape of a dragon in the grey powder. Her finger was a wand, a whisper, a spell. "Oh, look, Nai," she had said, her voice full of breathless certainty. "Enhe sleeps under the river stones." May had summoned a smile from some distant, tired place within her, a thin thing that barely touched her eyes. It was the only answer she could offer to such unblemished belief. Now, as the shuttle passed from left to right, the familiar motion faltered. A change had come into the room. It was not a draft from the open window, no sharp, insistent finger of cold. This was a presence, a slow, encompassing coolness that seemed to exhale into the space. It slipped through the window screen not with a whisper of wind, but with a presence that felt ancient and alive. It carried on its breath the scent of the river after a cleansing rain, the cool mineral smell of stones washed clean and woven through it, the impossibly sweet, ghostly perfume of night-blooming osmanthus. The hanging skeins of silk, dyed in hues of jade and twilight, did not rustle. They stirred with a sound that was not a sound at all, but a vibration felt deep in the bones of the house, in the hollow of May's chest. It was a low, resonant hum, a single note held for a beautiful, impossible moment, like a bronze temple bell struck once, 1,000 years ago. The very dust motes, which had danced their endless, frantic ballet in the lamplight, seemed to calm themselves, to settle slowly onto the floorboards as if put to bed. May's hands stilled on the shuttle. The loom fell silent. For the first time in hours, the only rhythm in the room was the soft, uncertain beat of her own heart. She turned her head, her gaze drawn to the high open window. Outside, the moon was a perfect polished pearl hung against a sweep of indigo velvet. And the clouds were not the usual tattered rags of vapor. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a great silent river flowing through the sky, their edges softened into mist. She saw no great beast, no scales of jade or claws of lightning, as the old stories promised. There was no shape to name, but in the way the moonlight filtered through the slow, drifting river of mist, casting, shifting, breathing patterns of silver and bruised gray upon the worn floorboards of her workshop, she felt it, a presence, an echo. It was the shadow of a story her own grandmother had told her, a story told in a voice that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. "And a great dragon does not roar," the old woman had murmured, her hand gently stroking May's childhood hair. "His breath is the gentlest of winds, Xiao Mei. It is the sigh that cools the summer night, a lullaby for the sleeping earth." A tremor went through her, a shudder not of fear, but of recognition. The wall she had so carefully constructed around her heart, a practical wall built of necessity and loss, of seasons that came and went without marvel, developed a hairline crack. Through it, a single bright image pushed forth like a stubborn weed. Lynn's eyes, dark and shining with an unwavering belief in a world that breathed magic. For the first time in a lifetime, it felt like May did not dismiss the thought. She allowed it to remain. She allowed herself to wonder. She pushed herself up, her joints protesting with a quiet ache. She stepped away from the loom, the instrument of her practicality, the keeper of her days. She walked to the window, her bare feet silent on the cool stone floor. Leaning her forehead against the rough-hewn wooden frame, she watched the slow, serpentine dance of the clouds. She listened, not with her ears, but with her skin, with the very marrow of her bones, to the whisper of the wind as it passed through the leaves of the ginkgo tree. The restless, chafing feeling in her chest, the weariness that had felt so absolute, began to dissolve. It did not vanish in a rush, but melted away slowly, like frost in the first hint of morning light. In its place, a quiet, unfamiliar awe began to bloom. The world outside her window was no longer just a dark landscape, a collection of shapes she knew by heart. It was a living painting of light and shadow, rendered in strokes of silver and deep, breathing violet, imbued with a gentle, watching spirit. The low hum of the wind seemed to find a resonance within her, a quiet vibration that matched the slow, steady beat of her own heart. She was no longer just a weaver in a silent room. She was a listener, a watcher, a small, still part of the great, quiet song of the night. Chapter 3. Sleep, which had once been a reliable friend, now held itself at a distance, a shy visitor lingering at the threshold of his consciousness. Li Wei lay on his sleeping mat, the woven reeds cool against his back, and listened to the profound stillness of his home. It was a silence made of familiar things, the sigh of the old wood in the walls, the whisper of a breeze through the paper screen. Yet tonight, and for many nights past, it was a hollow vessel, filled only by the echo of a sound he could not forget. The memory was not of a noise, but of a presence. It had risen from the riverbank not as an alarm, but as a note of immense, ancient peace, a vibration that had found a sympathetic hum in the hollow of his bones. It was like the single, perfect tone of a temple bell struck once, its resonance held not for a moment, but for what felt like an eternity, fading into the very fabric of the evening air. That feeling, that deep and resonant question, had followed him from his workshop, where the scent of beeswax and drying mulberry paper clung to his clothes, into the sparse quiet of his rooms. It was a gentle but persistent haunting, and so, night after night, he found himself rising from his bed. He did not return to the river. The answer, he felt, was not in the source of the sound, but in its effect. Drawn by a restlessness he hadn't known since his youth, he would slide his feet into his worn wooden sandals and walk, not toward the water, but away from the sleeping heart of the village. He followed the path where the last clay and timber houses gave way to the great, tiered expanse of the rice paddies. By day, this was a landscape of labor, of mud and sweat, and the familiar green of growing things. But under the moon, it was transformed. The world became a canvas rendered in silver and ink. The moon, high and serene, poured a milk-white lacquer over the surface of the flooded terraces, each one a polished mirror reflecting the silent drift of the heavens. The earthen dikes that separated them were strokes of the deepest, most velvety shadow, lines that gave the shining water its form. Here, in a silence broken only by the chirr of a lone cricket, a silence so profound it felt like the earth holding its breath, Li Wei began to watch. He first became aware of the mist. He had seen it 1,000 times, a commonplace detail of the damp valley mornings, but he had never truly seen it. It did not billow up from the warm water in chaotic plumes. It descended. It poured from the higher slopes in slow, deliberate rivers of smoke, flowing through the miniature valleys between the terraces with a languid, tidal grace. He watched how it clung to the tender green shoots of the young rice, each stalk beaded with a chain of droplets, every single one a tiny, perfect pearl of captured moonlight. A memory surfaced, as soft and quiet as the mist itself. His grandmother, her face a web of kind lines, her hand resting on his small shoulder. "That is the cloud dragon's breath," she had told him, her voice a low murmur. "Sleeps in the mountains and breathes out the evening mist, a gift of moisture for the sleeping earth." The folktale, once a simple comfort for a child afraid of the dark, now felt like an observable truth. He was witnessing it, this slow, deliberate exhalation that nourished the world while it slept. His gaze, drawn by this thought, lifted from the silvered earth to the deep bowl of the sky. He began to see the night not as a static backdrop of stars, but as a place of slow, immense movement. He watched the high, wispy clouds, so thin they were like veils of spun silk. And then, on a night of impossible clarity, when the stars burned with a cold, sharp fire, he perceived it. His eyes softened their focus. He did not look for it, but simply allowed it to be seen. It was not a shape of a beast with teeth and claws, the kind of dragon depicted on imperial banners and festival puppets. It was something far grander, far more elemental, a slow serpentine current in the highest vaults of the heavens, a celestial river of vapor and starlight that stretched from one edge of the horizon to the other. He could trace the gentle cosmic curve of its back, see the faint, shimmering edges of what might have been immense, translucent scales as they caught the light of distant suns. It was not a creature to be feared, but a living piece of the night sky itself, a guardian whose very being was a form of silent, unwavering protection. To witness this, not as a fleeting spectacle, but as a quiet, natural unfolding, was to feel something deep inside himself begin to change. The knot of tightness that had lived in his chest for so long, the feeling of being old and unsteady, his hands too clumsy for the delicate work that had once defined him, began to soften. It did not vanish, but its grip loosened. He felt his own smallness beneath that vast celestial presence, but it was a comforting smallness, the way a single grain of sand feels the inexorable, ancient rhythm of the tide. He understood, in a way that had no need for words, that his life, his anxieties, his dwindling purpose, his quiet griefs, was just one small breath in the great slow respiration of the world. The world was not indifferent. It was simply moving to a rhythm far older and gentler than his own. He was not just a maker of paper lanterns, he was a witness to the light in all its forms. As the deep ink of the sky began its slow turn towards the pale gray of morning, the great shape dissolved. Its form broke apart, softening back into the indistinct clouds of dawn. The mist, its work done, thinned and receded into the earth. Li Wei turned for home. The pre-dawn chill was sharp on his weathered face, but a quiet, steady warmth bloomed in his soul. He had not found an answer to his loneliness or a cure for his aging hands, but the nature of his questions had changed entirely. Entering his small home, he looked down at his own hands in the faint new light. He saw the raised veins, the wrinkled skin, the slight persistent tremor. But he no longer saw them as tools of a dwindling trade, symbols of his uselessness. He saw them as part of this larger breathing world. He saw them as the hands of a man who had felt the earth breathe and had seen the slow, silent turning of a dragon in the stars. He carried no grand revelation, only a quiet knowing, and for now, it was enough. Chapter 4. The night held its breath. It was a stillness unlike any other, a quiet so deep it felt like a pressure against the ear. The air, thin and brittle as spun glass, carried no scent of damp earth or evening dew. From the cool stone of her windowsill, May watched the moon hang in the starless ink, a perfect sterile coin of silver. Its light was sharp, carving the world into definite shapes of shadow and bone-white gleam, leaving no softness, no mystery between. Beneath the steady, almost frantic chirping of the crickets, another sound hummed, a frequency felt more than heard. It was the collective worry of the village, a low thrum of anxiety that rose from the baked earth and the parched roots of the young rice. The paddies, which should have been slick mirrors reflecting the sky, were matte and thirsty, their surfaces cracked into fine, web-like patterns. Each day, the sun had been a merciless brass gong in the sky, and each night had offered no respite. May rested her cheek against the cold stone, the roughness of familiar comfort. Her grandmother's voice surfaced from the deep well of memory, a murmur soft as warm silk. "And the land holds its breath," she had said, her hands tracing the veins on a withered leaf, waiting for the sky to remember it. May felt it now, that same held breath in her own lungs, in the tense set of her shoulders. The village was waiting. The very world seemed to be waiting. Then a change. It did not begin with a rush of wind or the distant rumble of thunder. It began as a slow bleed of light at the far edge of the horizon, a luminescence where there should have been only darkness. A form began to resolve itself against the night, not a cloud as she knew them, not the bruised purple of a storm front or the fluffy white of a fair day. This was a long, serpentine wisp, impossibly vast, that drifted into view with the unhurried grace of a river winding through a valley of stars. It glowed with a soft, internal fire, a pearlescent light like nacreous dust stirred into the deep indigo of the heavens. It coiled and uncoiled in a silent celestial dance, its form fluid and eternal, moving with a purpose that felt as ancient as the turning of the spheres. As the cloud dragon drew nearer, its immense, silent body eclipsing swaths of the sky, a sound began to swell. It was not the roar she had imagined from childhood tales, not a sound of fury or power. It was a whisper, deep and resonant, a tone that vibrated through the stone of the house and into the marrow of her bones. It was the sound of wind sighing through a forest of bamboo, of 1,000 silken tassels stirring in a forgotten temple, a low thrum that seemed to physically smooth the tension from the air. The restless leaves on the willow by the stream ceased their frantic rustling. The dust on the path, which had seemed to rise with every anxious footstep, settled into a quiet blanket. This was the lullaby, the one her grandmother had sung of, the one the stories promised. It was a sound that did not demand attention but gently commanded peace, a vibration that found the tight, knotted places in the world and slowly, patiently unwove them. And from the dragon's long, soft underbelly, a gift began to descend. It was not rain, not the hard, percussive drops that hammer the earth. It was a mist, a fine, cool breath that drifted down like a veil. It carried the scent of mountain springs running over moss-slicked stones, and the ghost of night-blooming jasmine. May watched, her own breath caught in her throat, her body utterly still. The mist settled upon the thirsty fields, a visible sigh of relief. It coated each delicate green shoot of rice, each one a tiny, hopeful spear, in a shimmering sheath of life-giving moisture. It kissed the curved tile roofs, turning them from dull clay to gleaming obsidian. It gathered in the hollows of the ancient stones that lined the pathways, filling them like tiny sacred pools. It was a quiet act of immense, gentle kindness, a blessing bestowed without fanfare, without expectation of thanks. Leaning out from the window, May closed her eyes and tilted her face to the sky. The cool mist settled on her cheeks, her eyelids, her lips. It was the softest touch she had ever known. With that touch, the knot of worry that had been cinched tight in her heart for weeks simply dissolved. It did not break or tear, but melted away, leaving in its place a profound and unshakable sense of peace. The anxiety that had hummed beneath the world was gone, replaced by the dragon's deep, sonorous lullaby. She understood then, in a way that bypassed thought and settled deep in her soul. The dragon was not a beast to be feared or a deity to be worshipped with offerings and pleas. It was a presence, a guardian whose very breath was an act of harmony. A living embodiment of the balance she had so feared was lost. In that moment, she was not merely May, a woman in a small house in a small village. She was a part of this slow, gentle exhalation, a single note in a vast and ancient song. She was a particle of earth being blessed by a particle of sky. The dragon's breath, the dragon's lullaby, was not just for the thirsty land. It was for every soul sleeping under its vast pearlescent shadow. And as she finally turned from the window, the soft, cool air filling her small room, she felt herself ready for a sleep deeper and more peaceful than any she had known. Chapter 5. The night held its breath, a deep indigo stillness that settled over the village like fine dust. In the quiet heart of it, in a workshop that smelled of shaved bamboo and cooling beeswax, Fen watched the flame. She had worked for weeks on this lantern, her hands, usually so deft with festival globes of crimson and gold, moving with a different kind of reverence. This was not for a crowd. This was a private communion. Its frame was of the lightest, most resilient bamboo, steamed and bent into a shape that suggested not a box, but a cupped hand. The silk panels, thin as a dragonfly's wing, were her masterwork. She had not painted dragons or phoenixes, but the quiet poetry of the world she knew. A stand of sleeping egrets, their heads tucked into the pale down of their backs. The soft maternal curve of the riverbank where the reeds grew thickest, the subtle, ink-washed shadow of a carp moving just beneath the water's surface. It was a lantern of slumbering things, of peace held in suspension. A summons had come to her, not in a voice, but as a subtle pressure in the air, a hum against her ribs that pulled her toward the fields. It was the feeling of a tide turning in the deepest part of her soul. With a hand that did not tremble, she touched a taper to the wick. The small flame caught with a faint hiss, blossoming into a perfect warm teardrop inside its silken chamber, casting a gentle, honeyed light upon her worn tools and the patient grain of the wood walls. She walked the path, its ochre earth so familiar it held a memory in her soles. But tonight, it was a passage into another state of being. A mist, born of the water and the cooling earth, began to rise. It was not the biting fog of winter, but something soft and alive, pearlescent in the moonlight. It swirled around her ankles, a cool kiss against her skin, climbing her legs like a silken robe. The scent it carried was not of decay, but of life in its most tranquil form. Damp soil, rich and dark, and the ghostly perfume of night-blooming jasmine from a garden she could no longer see. The world beyond the small, warm circle of her lantern's glow dissolved. The sharp edges of the paddies, the distant silhouette of the hills, all became soft, impressionistic shapes, daubs of indigo and silver on the vast canvas of the night. In this sudden, profound isolation, a shiver of a feeling she thought long buried surfaced: loneliness. It was a brief human tremor, the old ache of an empty room, of a meal eaten in silence. But as quickly as it came, the mist soothed it. The quiet was not empty, it was full. It was a presence in itself, a balm that seeped into the old cracks of her heart. She stopped at the edge of the widest paddy. Its surface, undisturbed by any breeze, was a flawless obsidian mirror for the full moon hanging serene and white in the cosmos. Here, the summons was strongest. Holding her masterwork high, its light a single steady ember against the immense quiet, she waited, and the mist answered. Above the dark water, it thickened. It did not tear the silence with a sudden apparition. It gathered, the way a thought gathers behind the eyes. It coalesced, not into a fearsome beast of scale and claw, but into a flowing, luminous form of cloud and moonlight, a living geography of vapor and light. An immense, gentle eye opened within the swirling form. It was the color of ancient jade, deep and clear, and it held no malice, only a vast and knowing compassion, the kind one might find in the gaze of a mountain that has witnessed 1,000 seasons. It regarded her, and in its depths, Fen saw the reflection of her own small, steady flame. There was no roar. There was only a sound that was also a feeling, a vast, quiet exhalation that seemed to issue from the beginning of time. It was the dragon's breath. The sound hummed in her very bones, a resonant frequency that shivered through the water and rustled every single reed along the bank, each one bowing in unison. The breeze that followed this breath was the lullaby. It was not a melody of notes that could be written or sung, but a current of pure feeling that washed over her. It was a texture on the skin, a scent in the air, a memory in the heart. In its gentle passage, Fen heard the cool recollection of rain finally falling on parched fields. She felt the deep, dreaming peace of ancestors sleeping beneath the silent hills, their stories woven into the soil. She tasted the faint, clean promise of the coming dawn, still hours away but already a certainty. The knot of quiet grief she had carried for so long a dense, hard thing in her chest, did not break or shatter. It simply dissolved, the way a pinch of salt dissolves in water, its essence unspooling and being absorbed into the loving, misty presence that surrounded her. She understood then, with a clarity that was as soft as the mist itself. The dragon did not vanquish sorrow, it cradled it. It took the pain and transformed it, breathing it out as the mist that nourished the sleeping land. With a grace she did not know she possessed, Fen lowered the lantern in a slow, reverent arc, a bow not of supplication but of kinship. She felt no awe for a deity, no fear of a primordial power. What she felt was a deep, resonant connection, the same connection she felt to the stone beneath her feet and the stars above her head. This was a guardian spirit, as much a part of the world as the river and the rain. The great jade eye blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement. It was an acknowledgement of her offering, her grief, her pilgrimage, and her awakening. Then, as gently as it had formed, the cloud dragon began to drift apart. Its luminous body became a silent river of soft cloud, flowing across the face of the moon, its light seeming to soften and pulse as the form passed over it. The mist thinned. The sharp, silver edges of the world slowly returned. One by one, the stars reappeared, pricking the deep velvet of the sky. The chirr of a single cricket broke the profound silence. Fen was left standing alone at the water's edge, her lantern still glowing warmly in her hand. The air was clear and cool now, but the lullaby had not left her. It was no longer in the wind, but within her, a quiet hum echoing not in her ears, but in the peaceful, newly spacious chambers of her own heart. Chapter 6. #SAG Chapter 6. The Weaver's Breath. The house was a vessel of stillness, cradling the deep velvet dark. Sleep had not called to May, or perhaps she had chosen not to answer. Instead, she sat at the loom, a silent sentinel in her own small world. Outside, the moon was a pearl button sewn onto the vast black silk of the sky, and its light poured through the open window, not in a harsh, revealing beam, but as a liquid pool of silver upon the floorboards. It was a light as soft and cool as spun silk, catching the dust motes as they danced their slow, suspended ballet in the air. Her hands, which had once flown across the threads with the panicked flutter of a trapped bird, now moved with a grace that was nearly imperceptible. The shuttle passed from left to right, a smooth, deliberate breath. There was no urgency here, no merchant's deadline shadowing her thoughts. The clack and slide of the heddles, the soft thud of the beater against the weft, these were not the sounds of frantic labor anymore. They were a quiet percussion, the steady, resting heartbeat of the night itself. And in that rhythmic pulse, a new pattern was being born, one that had bloomed from the quiet soil of her own heart. She was weaving the scales of a dragon, not as a creature of fire and fury, but as a being of cloud and air. Shimmering silver threads, fine as moonlight, intertwined with a jade so pale it was almost white, creating a gentle overlapping geometry that seemed to shift and breathe in the lunar glow. Each pass of the shuttle was a prayer, a meditation, a quiet conversation with the silence. Then, a change in the air. A breeze, not born of the mountain pass or the valley floor, drifted through the window. It was cooler than the night, carrying a fragrance that was both familiar and otherworldly. The ghost of night-blooming jasmine, the rich, clean scent of damp earth after a long-awaited rain. It was a presence more than a current of air. It rustled the finished bolts of silk that hung from a nearby beam, their surfaces whispering against one another like dry leaves. A slow, knowing smile touched May's lips. She did not look up, did not turn her head toward the window. There was no need. She felt the cloud dragon's presence not as a grand, thundering spectacle, but as this, an intimate caress, a subtle shift in the temperature of the room, a deepening of the silence. The lullaby she had once strained so desperately to hear was no longer a melody carried on the wind. It was the space between the sounds, the coolness on her skin, the peaceful, unwavering rhythm she had finally discovered in the patient work of her own two hands. Before the first blush of dawn could dilute the deep indigo of the sky, she cut her work from the loom. Not the entire bolt, but a small, perfect square of the cloud-scale silk. It felt cool and impossibly smooth in her hands, a tangible piece of the night's peace. She slipped out of her cottage, her bare feet silent on the worn, cool stone of the path that wound through the sleeping village. The mist, the dragon's customary gift, was thick and soft, clinging to the bowed eaves of the tiled roofs and settling like a downy blanket over the terraced rice paddies. The world was rendered in shades of grey and silver, a vast watercolor painting still wet on the page. She moved through it like a ghost, her own breath pluming softly in the chilled air. Her destination was the small, unassuming home of the old tea grower, the man whose simple words had tilted her world on its axis. She knelt, her knees pressing into the damp stone of his doorstep, and placed the silk square there. It lay like a fallen star against the dark wood, its shimmering scales catching the faintest hint of pre-dawn light. There was no note, no grand gesture. The silk was its own message, a silent, woven gratitude. It was a testament to a shared wisdom that had no need for words, a quiet understanding passed from one heart that had learned to listen to another. Returning to her own small cottage, May finally felt the gentle pull of rest. The eastern sky was beginning to soften, painted in the most delicate watercolors of rose and lavender. She lay down on her sleeping mat, the rough spun linen a familiar comfort against her skin. She closed her eyes, but the world did not fall away into the oblivion of sleep. Instead, it sharpened, deepened. She felt her connection to it all, to the quiet breath of the tea grower in his small house, to the silent, misty fields awaiting the sun, to the gentle, colossal guardian who even now was drifting through the dissipating clouds above. The dragon's lullaby, she understood at last, was never a song to be captured or possessed. It was a harmony to be joined, and as she lay there, feeling the slow, steady beat of her own heart, she finally, truly, heard it. And so, as the last wisp of the cloud dragon dissolved into the morning light, the weaver found her peace, not in the sky, but within. Her breath became the breeze, her work became the song. May you find such harmony in your own quiet moments. Good night. What simple rhythm, a walk, a craft, a quiet cup of tea, helps you feel connected to the world? We would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments.